Hello and welcome to the Dissect and Connect podcast. I'm your host, Mike Wade. This is the podcast where we explore population health issues impacting your community. Dissect and Connect is a service of New River Valley Community Services and the Montgomery County Prevention Partners. Moe McClanahan is a high-tech crime specialist with the National White Collar Crime Center. Recently retired after 20 years of service from the Christiansburg Police Department in Virginia, Moe served her last 8.5 years with the Christiansburg PD as their Internet Crimes Against Children investigator. During her time in this role, Moe trained and educated over 10,000 children, parents, and police officers in Internet safety. Moe also serves as the Director of Training and Education with the Safe Surfin Foundation, where she continues to educate on Internet safety. So, Moe, welcome to the Dissect and Connect podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're excited to have you with us today. I've introduced you to the listeners with a brief bio, but I was hoping you could maybe tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, so I am a mom of one boy, so I'm married to a police officer as well, retired in January with 20 years in law enforcement, and really some background. I grew up in upstate New York, and my senior year of high school, I moved to Colorado with my dad. And that's where I went to University of Northern Colorado. And at one point, I just decided I wanted to live in Virginia. Like, it didn't matter where, I just wanted to live here. And I knew with a lot of my friends that were getting into law enforcement, they were struggling finding jobs. And so I knew I needed to find an internship. And since I wanted to live in Virginia, I came out here and interviewed for several different internships and landed one at Cardinal Criminal Justice Academy in Salem. And so in 97, I interned there, met Chief Brown with Blacksburg Police Department. I said, that's who I want to work for. And when I was about to graduate, I sent him a graduation announcement, and he told me to come on back. So in 99 is when I first started working at Blacksburg. And then I was there about 3.5 years, moved back to New York after 9/11 to be with family. And then my certification was still good, so I came back and I worked at Pulaski Police Department, and I was there for 4.5 years. And when I started there, I was undercover narcotics, and that was a lot of fun. And then in 2008 is when I started with the Christiansburg Police Department. And in 2012 is when I was full-time Internet Crimes Against Children investigator, but I'd had the training when I was in Pulaski as well. So I have over 10 years of experience working those types of cases.
Okay. Well, I got to go back for a second. What was the appeal of Virginia? Why did you want to live here so much?
It's kind of silly, but it was I really wanted to be an FBI agent, which a lot of kids, going into law enforcement have that dream. And so when I went to DC, I really felt like I was supposed to be somewhere near DC. And even though Southwest Virginia is almost like a different state than DC, I had friends that lived up there, so I visited quite a lot, a few times when I was younger and single, and but just never made it that way. Actually, as I got older, I'd applied a couple times, but as I got older, I just really felt the need to be able to serve the community that I lived in. Mm-hmm. And so that's really what's kept me here. And I have made Southwest Virginia my home, and I'm not going anywhere. So I love it here. Great. So I'm curious, what made you choose law enforcement as a career? And that's a silly question. So 21 Jump Street was my passion, the series, if
Gotcha.
You remember that.
Yep.
So every summer I would catch the replays and actually recorded them on our VHS, and I just loved the idea I loved the undercover part of 21 Jump Street. And so once I knew I wanted to be in law enforcement, I literally just set my goals up to make sure that I achieved it. And I lived the life. try to be straight and narrow as much as I could throughout college, and just always networked with people to get me into a position that is where I wanted to be.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
I did not expect the 21 Jump Street reference, but here we are.
Well, and it's funny because when I was in the academy, Chief Brown had actually called me to say, how do you feel about, going to a fraternity party? And I thought it was a really strange question, but he needed me to go in undercover. And so they were illegally selling alcohol at the door. And so I remember calling my dad up and said, Dad, you're not going to believe it. I'm totally going 21 Jump Street. And I'm not even graduated from the academy. So, it's been pretty amazing.
Yeah, so check that off the bucket list, right?
Yeah.
Hey, what is it about internet crimes that specifically appealed to you?
Well, I know when I worked in Blacksburg, one of the detectives, just before he retired, he had approached me mainly because there's only two of us females that were on the road at the time at Blacksburg. And he knew that I had interest in investigations. And so he had approached me and had told me a little bit about the internet crimes against children, but it was called Blue Ridge Thunder back then. So I don't know if you remember that name.
Sounds like a baseball team.
Yeah. Eric Estrada was our spokesperson back then too.
Oh, I do remember that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so he plugged that into my ear, and so I just kind of researched it, and I knew a little bit of background about it, and I had approached some of the command staff at Blacksburg, and they just didn't really see it as something part of their mission at Blacksburg. Like, they just didn't see it as a part of the plan. And so but it always stayed in my head, and I knew that I wanted to specialize in something. And then I moved back to New York for family after 9/11, but it just never left my heart that I was supposed to do something big. And so when I came back and I worked in Pulaski, once I came out of undercover and was back on the road, I started researching how to get in contact with Bedford County, and they really just opened up their doors and allowed me to come in and kind of shadow them for a little bit. And then I started researching the training, and I just loved the aspect of being able to kind of intercept the bad guys from getting to our kids. And even back then in like 2006, it wasn't huge. Like the internet wasn't as accessible as it is now, and our kids didn't really have access to it back then either. But I saw the increase, and I saw how the predators were using the internet to victimize children back then. And now as it's grown, it's just we use the internet for everything, and a lot of parents don't understand what's really going on behind the scenes and the dangers, because they're not having access to that. So just knowing that I could help the kids and make an impact to prevent victimization from, something that, even if it's not hands-on, but it's just as traumatic.
Right. So for our listeners who maybe aren't familiar with this term or what it means, can you give a little bit of an overview about the scope of these crimes and what that includes?
Well, and we receive, mainly what I go off of are the statistics from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, because they monitor the cyber tip line. So anytime somebody wants to make a report anonymously, or if some of the social media platforms like Google or Facebook, if they see crimes being committed through their site, they make the record to the cyber tip line. And so I can tell you that those records, just from, prior to COVID, the numbers for, say, images of child sexual abuse material, or most people know it as child pornography. The average amount of reports throughout the world, I think it's the world, the average report a week were around 250 to 300,000 reports. And that, I went back and I researched it, because once COVID hit, I can tell you that I had a lot of anxiety. I was feeling very overwhelmed because I wasn't going to be able to reach all the parents, and I knew kids were coming home with Chromebooks and having access to the internet, and the parents were not ready for it.
Right.
And the schools weren't equipped to notify everybody, to sit them down and say, look, we're taking all these steps to make sure that we're safeguarding your kids. Like, nothing was being put out, at least not in our community. And so I knew that parents were needing something. And so I was really concerned about those numbers. And so I saw them skyrocket to almost 1 million reports in 1 week. Last year, it was, I want to say in July, did it start going up to almost 900,000 reports in 1 week of just images of child pornography.
Wow.
So whether the kids were self-victimizing and taking the pictures themselves, whether they're being exploited online, or if child predators were exchanging them using social media.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
So you touched upon this a little bit earlier in something that you said, but I wanted to ask you how this area of crime has changed since you first started specializing in it.
Right. So when I first started, like I said, the children really didn't have as much access, especially to social media. That wasn't even that big. I remember teaching internet safety in Pulaski on MySpace, and I think one of the other sources was Zanga or something like that. I can't remember what it's called. I just can see a picture in my head. But and I remember thinking I needed to learn a little bit more about it to see what the kids were doing so I could actually educate on it. But there wasn't a whole lot of access, honestly. But now, with all of the different social media, like Facebook spinned off of MySpace, and there's over 533 million plus users. At least that's how many users data was leaked last weekend. But so there's more than that. But there's a whole lot of people on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and these sites that honestly parents don't realize that the kids have to be 13 to be on that, and that's for their protection, and that's through the Privacy Protection Act for children that a lot of parents are not aware of. And so where everybody's has access to smartphones, and the kids are getting younger and younger as they have access to these phones, because we're losing the landlines. People aren't using landlines, and the mentality that they need to be connected to their kids 24 hours a day it's just so different than what we were growing up with. And so the accessibility, before I was just seeing more the child predators on there exchanging and uploading images of the abuse that they were doing. But now we're seeing the predators actually victimizing the child in real time on social media, and then the child producing the sexual abuse material that's being re-shared in like a lot of adult porn sites and without the child's permission. And once it's put out there, you can't take it back. And that's what's really scary, and a lot of people don't think about. So, really going from just the child predators on there communicating with each other to now the children being victimized in real time.
In addition to the increased access that you touched upon, and I think rightfully so, what are the other biggest concerns out there with this technology at the moment?
I would say the screen addiction. That once we were seeing some cases where children were so addicted and so connected to their profile, to their life online, that we're seeing that the predators are able to utilize that vulnerability to really attack them, to do something so unheard of, and sometimes violent to their own family members, and just so they can get their account back. And for an example, it was a case involving Snapchat, and the kids were accepting friend requests from strangers, and once they got into that, the stranger would see the group of friends in like maybe a group chat or something, would pretend to be a friend and ask for passwords. And kids are sharing their passwords with their friends.
Yeah.
It's crazy, but so they would then seize the account. And they would tell the kids that, if you want your account back, then you need to send this naked picture.
Mm.
And they would do it because they were so obsessed with their streaks, with their, their connections to everybody on there, their stories, whatever that might be. And to think about being that connected and that obsessed about it is very damaging for them. I mean, it's no different than being a drug addict. Like, you wouldn't want your 12-year-old to be a drug addict.
Right.
So, and I even use addiction to explain it to my own son that, I have to be that person that prevents you from being addicted. Like, you always need help, even as adults. And so when we do a detox, I explain to them it's not a matter of being punished. It's a matter of setting you up so you're not only connected to that, because then your brain's not being creative anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they're not doing things on they're bored within 5 minutes of being at a restaurant.
Right.
And so, which we did that too when he was younger. And then when I started learning more about it, I was like, ooh, that is not healthy. So I would say that.
So, what would you rank as enemy number one when it comes to this stuff?
That's a good question. I think we're our own worst enemies, honestly, because we're so curious, and especially during COVID, we're so lonely.
Yeah.
And so trying to either find connection, but we're only finding negativity, but then we can't not be on it because it's just, that's what's there. It occupies our time. And even though we think that it's decreasing our anxiety, it's actually increasing our anxiety. You're faced with comparing yourself to others. You're faced to be, a lot of the kids are seeing cyberbullying. So I would say we're our own worst enemies.
Well, I think that's a fair assessment. Sad but true.
Yeah. So
who's most vulnerable to these types of crimes?
There is no set vulnerability. There is no set victim set. There's everybody, because we all have vulnerabilities. And if we are either sharing them, or if we are going to the internet and social media to hide away from some insecurities or vulnerabilities, they're going to find that out. So it's really, you can't really explain. You can't, if I could, then we'd be able to prevent it way more, because then we could focus on just that group of kids or adults.
Right.
But everybody falls victim. And I always think of my friend Amanda when she was 14, so they had a computer in their home pretty early, and she fell victim. She was in church group. She was a cheerleader. She was a happy kid, and he manipulated her enough to make her think he was 16. He even talked her out of her home to meet him at the park when he doesn't even, like, her telling the story now. She's like, as a teenager, I didn't think about how would he know that there's a park at the end of my street when he supposedly lived in Virginia Beach and he was visiting. Like, how did he know that? But she's like, I just didn't think about it. Yeah. And so, I was walking down to the park, and a 35-year-old man abducted her. And so, luckily, he returned her, but not the way that he picked her up at. So, anybody.
In addition to the abuse and exploitation, the obvious things that you've already talked about, why is it important for us to be mindful of these risks associated with internet use?
As parents and guardians, it's our place to make sure that we are keeping an eye on our kids' activities. We are setting guidelines, sharing expectations, and having these conversations, because the kids don't know. A lot of times I would have the parents come into the office after their child either exchanged images with another child or something that kids do, the parent would come in and say, well, I raised them better than that. And I would ask them, did you ever tell them never send naked pictures of yourself? And usually that conversation never comes up.
Right.
They just expect, but the child doesn't know that that's an expectation.
Mm-hmm.
And they see either their friends or their peers doing it. And then it just kind of is just kind of left behind. And so I think that that's just really why we need to be mindful. And, and there's things that I share with the parents because they're usually around my age that if you remember, and I've talked about this, like I've heard of people doing this, but some people our age when they were younger may have mooned a vehicle or maybe flashed a vehicle. I mean, I've heard stories of that.
Me too.
Can you imagine if we had cell phones back then? We were doing it. It was just for different reasons, and it wasn't in secret, and it wasn't harming us because it never came back to us.
Right.
Maybe somebody saw it and they said, I saw you do that, and we're like, that wasn't me. Like you could totally blame it on somebody else, or there was no proof. So, so it's just like it's like kids being kids, like it's nothing to shame them about.
Right.
It is what it is. Kids make mistakes. We all make mistakes. But if you're having these conversations ahead of time
mm-hmm.
and being mindful as the parent and putting it in play for the kids, then, you're really setting everybody up for success.
And you've kind of led me beautifully into my next question, which was, do parents, grandparents, or other caregivers need to have a high level of tech savvy to be able to effectively protect their kids?
Not necessarily. So what I always suggest is that you give your child a device that you know how to use.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't know how to use an iPhone, don't give them an iPhone. It's just like driving a vehicle. If you can't teach them how to drive that car, you're not going to give them the keys to it and say, good luck.
What a great point.
Yeah. And so, if I have a lot of parents say, well, I'm just not tech savvy. I don't know how to do that. And I said, then don't give it to them.
Mm.
Like you should always be ahead of the game.
Yeah.
I mean, parents won't be, but you should at least try to be, like have some advantage. And if you're giving them something that you don't know anything about, you'll never have advantage.
Mm. Yeah. Wow. That's probably something that's going to make a lot of parents think twice.
I hope so.
Yeah. And you've alluded to this already. It's way more than just Facebook that they have to be worried about, right?
Oh, yes. Like, kids aren't using Facebook.
Yeah.
Yeah, because...
That's for old people.
Older people.
Like
yeah,
me.
That's old people. I mean, not me, but the older people. They're using it. And so they're using, again, a social media platform that the parent probably doesn't know anything about.
Mm-hmm.
Instagram, very similar to Facebook. There were some cases that I worked with Instagram, but it's only because they were offending in another location.
Right.
But Instagram, as long as you have access to your child's profile, it's not too bad. Just knowing that there's private messages in the behind the scenes,
mm-hmm.
but there's also disappearing photos that can be in those messages. Just learn how the app works. But when it comes to something like Snapchat and the parents aren't using Snapchat, knowing that the mentality of a child that's using that platform is that it'll disappear.
Right.
And so it's completely opposite of Facebook and Instagram, where you want to have those memories.
Mm-hmm.
You are living life through photos and sharing it. Can you imagine if you sent something on Snapchat that you thought disappeared and it said, look, your 1 year memory, you posted this a year ago, and you're like, I thought that disappeared. Like, yeah. I don't want to see that.
Right.
So how is that positive for anybody to use?
Mm-hmm. And
anybody that knows me knows that I am totally against Snapchat. I've been against it from the very beginning because it sets the mindset up that it's not good. It's not positive.
Mm-hmm.
there's filters that make you laugh and it might bring you joy, but if a picture brought you joy, then why would you want it to disappear?
Right.
And so I just think it sets it up for more of a negative mindset.
And there are the two, speaking of Snapchat, there are the two recent stories at the national level about young people who have accessed illicit substances through Snapchat, through a dealer, and have unfortunately gotten more than they bargained for and actually passed away from overdose. So another thing to be mindful of.
Absolutely, because these predators, whether it's a child predator or somebody preying on vulnerable people, whether they have a drug addiction or whatever, but they think that they can remain anonymous and just all they care about is the money.
Right.
And so when it comes to the drugs, or they just care, I mean, there's types of crimes such as sextortion too, that they want money. They don't care about the person behind the profile. Right. They just want, the money or whatever that looks like.
Yeah, it's a job for them.
Correct.
In a lot of cases.
Yes.
So you and I first connected a while back because the Giles Youth Adult Partnership that I'm involved with had some discussions around internet safety and use of social media apps, and so we reached out to you, and you've graciously agreed to lead a presentation for us this coming Monday. And definitely don't want to steal too much thunder from Monday's program because we want people to tune in, but what can folks expect to hear when they check out our program on Monday night?
Right, so I have used a very similar presentation in the past, but I've added onto it, as I always have, one based on the audience. I always like to make sure that it's specific to the community that I'm speaking to, and you told me some of the concerns. And so we'll just do an overview of basic internet safety. We'll talk about what a digital footprint looks like for them, and then how to minimize it to better safeguard their family. And then we'll touch on the topic of sexting, sextortion, illegal activities through social media. And then, based on time, we'll see if we can hit on some cyberbullying and just really help equip parents on better being mindful, like you said, and being able to set guidelines. And we'll also talk about some monitoring apps that can really help them have a little bit more control, with also allowing their child the access without having the anxiety.
Okay, great. Yeah. Well, you listeners, make sure you tune in for that on Monday night. It's going to be a great program. I'm very excited about that. Hey, Mo, do you have any resources to share with our listeners?
Yes, so if you go to our website at safesurfin.org, so it's safe and then SURFIN.org. Okay. We have created a blog there where we've been giving tips out on a weekly basis. It's also on our Instagram, which is safe.surfin. And, we just want to make sure that we're equipping people the best that we know how, despite not being able to be in person, and just really reach them through the virtual world as long as we have to.
All right, great. And then before I let you go, do you have any parting words of wisdom for our audience?
So, one, I really hope that you attend. Two, this conversation or this presentation, no, it's not joyful. It's not, stuff that we want to talk about. But at the same time, I really hope that this presentation hits some points to really help start these conversations, because I think that's where it's so hard, is you just don't know where to start, especially at different ages. And especially for parents and guardians that have different ages, younger kids up to high school, there's things at every level. And I've learned, even being a parent myself, what's appropriate at what age. And once you start that, it becomes a building block to really just keep leveraging all the way up through school as they have more access, as they are not in our sight as much, and that they're going to make safe choices without us being there to make them for them. So I really think that that's really going to help our kids to really equip them through this presentation.
Fantastic. That's great. And again, very excited about Monday evening's program, and just want to thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and would love to have you back on the show at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to come back anytime.
Dissect and Connect is sponsored by Teen Connections, a leadership program through Planned Parenthood South Atlantic that empowers youth with the facts about sexual health and the skills to build stronger, healthier relationships. It's free, totally virtual, and you can earn $100 when you graduate as a Teen Connections peer educator in your community. Join a Teen Connections program from home today. For more information, be sure to check out the show notes from today's episode. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Dissect and Connect podcast. To learn more about Montgomery County Prevention Partners, our New River Valley Community Services, be sure to check us out on Facebook or visit nrvcs.org/podcast.